It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me, my friends, and a weekend away from everything, camping in the woods. We all needed a break, and this seemed like the perfect spot. Deep enough into the forest that we wouldn't run into anyone else, but not so far from civilization that it felt dangerous. Or so we thought. There were four of us. Me, Mark, my best friend Ryan, his girlfriend Jess, and her cousin Emma. We've been planning this trip for weeks, looking forward to getting away from our boring day-to-day lives. Ryan had found the location online, a secluded area near the old Blackwood Trail. No one really went there anymore, which made it all the more appealing. Less crowded, more peaceful. Perfect. How much longer? Jess asked, glancing over her shoulder as the trees seemed to get thicker. Not far, Ryan said, checking his map. He had a way of sounding confident even when he wasn't entirely sure. We'll be there before sunset, I promise. Emma didn't say much. She was always the quiet one, content with just following along. I could see she was a little uneasy, though. I didn't blame her. The deeper we got into the woods, the more oppressive it felt. Like the trees were closing in around us, watching us somehow. It's too quiet, I said, mostly to myself, but Ryan heard. He laughed. That's the point, man. No traffic, no noise. Just us and nature. It's peaceful. But it didn't feel peaceful. Something about the silence made me uneasy. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the dead leaves. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We were fine. Everything was fine. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally arrived at the spot Ryan had picked out. A small clearing surrounded by trees that towered over us like ancient giants. The ground was flat enough for our tents, and there was plenty of space for a fire pit. It looked perfect, just like Ryan had promised. This is it, Ryan said, dropping his backpack with a grin. Told you guys it'd be worth it. Jess smiled and started setting up her tent while Emma and I gathered wood for the fire. We didn't talk much, but I could tell she was still on edge. I was too, though I didn't want to admit it. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, the fire crackled to life. We sat around it, laughing and joking like we always did. The unease I'd felt earlier started to fade, replaced by the warmth of the flames and the comfort of being with my friends. Maybe Ryan was right. Maybe I was overthinking it. All right, who's got a scary story? Ryan said, leaning back with a grin. Really? Jess groaned. Do we have to do this? Come on, it's tradition. Ryan insisted. Camping's not complete without a good ghost story. I'm out, Emma said, shaking her head. I don't need to hear any creepy stories while we're stuck out here in the middle of nowhere. Oh, come on, Emma. Don't be a chicken, Ryan teased. I was about to chime in when I heard something, just a faint sound at first, like leaves rustling. It was so soft that I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, a little louder. A branch snapped in the distance, and I froze. Did you guys hear that? I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Ryan frowned. Hear what? That sound. Like something moving in the trees. Jess rolled her eyes. Great. Now Mark's trying to scare us. No, seriously, I insisted, standing up. Something's out there. We all fell silent, listening. The fire crackled, but beyond that, the forest was still. Too still. Then there was again a faint rustling, followed by another snap like something was moving closer. Jess's face paled, and Emma shot me a nervous glance. Ryan stood up, shining his flashlight toward the trees. Probably just an animal, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Maybe we should check it out, I suggested, though part of me really didn't want to. Ryan hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, let's take a look, just to be safe. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the noise, leaving Jess and Emma by the fire. The woods seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, more threatening. Every step felt heavier, like the trees were pressing in on us, suffocating us. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just some animal or the wind, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Do you see anything? I whispered, scanning the trees with my light. Ryan shook his head. Nothing. I told you it's prob. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the forest, cutting him off. Something big had moved, something close. We both spun around, but there was nothing there. just the trees and the darkness beyond. Okay, that was definitely not just an animal, Ryan muttered. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Let's get back to the fire. Without another word, we turned and hurried back to the clearing. Jess and Emma were waiting for us, their faces pale and anxious. "Well," Jess asked, her voice shaky. "What was it?" "We didn't see anything," Ryan said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. I sat down by the fire, my mind racing. Something wasn't right about this place. I could feel it in my gut, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to freak everyone out. Not yet. Instead, I just stared into the flames, trying to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night had only just begun. The fire crackled and popped, sending small embers floating up into the air as the night deepened. Despite the warmth of the flames, a chill had settled in my bones that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the cold. Something about the silence of the woods had started to feel wrong. Ryan sat across from me, poking at the fire with a long stick. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by a focused frown. Jess was leaning against him, her eyes darting nervously to the edge of the clearing every few seconds, while Emma sat quietly, hugging her knees to her chest. I tried to break the tension. "Maybe we just overreacted," I said, though I didn't even believe my own words. "It's a forest. There are animals everywhere. Could have been anything out there." Ryan nodded, but he wasn't really listening. He was staring off into the trees, as if waiting for something to move again. "Maybe," Jess said, but her voice was thin, shaky. I don't know. It feels weird, Mark. Doesn't it feel weird to you?" I didn't answer. The truth was, it felt more than weird. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, watching us, waiting. But I didn't want to scare them, so I forced a smile. "We're fine, just tired. Let's get some rest, and everything will seem less creepy in the morning." Emma looked over at me, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Do you really think we're safe here?" "I think we're fine," I lied. "We got the fire. Nothing's going to bother us with it going." That seemed to calm her down a little, but not much. Jess gave me a small, grateful smile, though her hands still trembled as she adjusted her jacket. Ryan tossed another log onto the fire and stood up. "All right, guys, let's get some sleep. We've got another day of hiking tomorrow, and I don't want to spend it all paranoid about a couple of sounds in the woods." "Easy for you to say," Jess muttered, but she followed him to the tent they shared. Emma didn't move. She just stayed sitting by the fire, staring into the flames like they held some kind of answer. "You good?" I asked, sitting down next to her. She shrugged. I don't know. I don't like this place. I have a bad feeling, Mark." I sighed. "You're not alone in that. But we're out here now, and we'll be fine. We've done this before." "Yeah, but not here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it feels different." I wanted to tell her she was being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the feeling she was right. Something about this forest did feel different. The air was heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on us. And the quiet, it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet I had hoped for. It was the kind that made your skin crawl. "Let's just try to get some sleep," I said finally. "We can pack up in the morning and head out early if you want." Emma nodded, but didn't move. I stayed with her for a while longer, just watching the fire as it flickered and danced, throwing strange shadows on the surrounding trees. Eventually, we both turned in for the night, Emma crawling into her small tent, and me into mine. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, or more accurately, the lack of them. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. Just silence, thick and suffocating. It was as if the whole world had gone still, waiting for something to happen. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, the one that whispered that maybe we shouldn't have come here. Maybe the rumors about these woods weren't just stories. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't peaceful. I had strange dreams, dark and jumbled, filled with shadows moving through the trees, just out of reach. I saw shapes, tall, twisted figures with eyes that glowed in the dark, staring at me from the forest. Their gaze felt cold, like ice crawling across my skin. I woke with a start, heart racing, the sound of footsteps echoing in my mind. For a second, I wasn't sure if I had really heard them or if they were just part of the dream. I sat up, straining to listen. There was again a soft crunch, like something walking just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling as I gripped it tight. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness inside the tent. Everything was normal, but that didn't stop my heart from pounding. I stayed still, listening, but the sound was gone. Whatever or whoever had been out there wasn't moving anymore. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. Maybe I was just on edge from the dream. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I lay back down, keeping the flashlight in my hand, just in case. I didn't fall asleep again for a long time, my ears straining to catch any other sounds, any sign that something or someone was out there. The rest of the night passed in eerie, unsettling quiet. And when dawn finally broke, I wasn't sure if I was more relieved or terrified that nothing had happened. When morning finally came, I was relieved to hear the familiar sounds of the forest returning. Birds chirped from the treetops, and the wind rustled through the leaves. It almost felt normal again. Almost. I crawled out of my tent and saw Ryan already up, poking at the dying embers of the fire. Jess and Emma were still asleep, their tents zipped up tight. Ryan looked over at me and gave a half-hearted smile. "Rough night?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, rubbing my eyes. "You?" He shrugged. "Didn't sleep much. Thought I heard something outside the tent a couple of times, but it was probably just animals." I frowned. "Same. There were definitely footsteps, though." "You don't think?" "I don't know, maybe there's someone else out here." Ryan stood up, stretching his arms over his head. "Doubt it. This place is practically abandoned. Besides, we would have seen or heard someone by now if they were camping nearby." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling from last night. There was something off, something we weren't seeing. But what? We spent the next hour getting breakfast ready, just some oatmeal and coffee over the campfire. Emma finally emerged from her tent, looking bleary-eyed and tired, but Jess stayed curled up, still asleep. Emma sat down next to me, warming her hands by the fire. "Feel better?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She shrugged. "Not really. I still don't like this place, Mark. I keep feeling like we're not alone." Ryan, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "We're alone, Em. There's no one out here but us." Emma didn't argue, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I felt it too. Still, we tried to push the thoughts away as we packed up the campsite. The plan was to hike deeper into the woods, explore a little more, and maybe find the old Blackwood cabin that Ryan had read about online. According to the map, it was abandoned long ago, but he thought it would be cool to check out. As we started hiking, the atmosphere felt different in the daylight. The sun was shining through the trees, and the warmth of it helped ease some of the tension that had built up overnight. For a while, everything seemed fine, peaceful, even, but that didn't last. After about an hour of walking, we reached a dense area where the trees were packed close together, their branches weaving overhead, casting long, dark shadows on the ground. The air felt cooler here, and the silence had returned. No birds, no rustling, just us. "This is it," Ryan said, stopping and pulling out his map. He squinted at it for a moment before pointing off to the right. "The cabin should be just up ahead, through there." I followed his gaze and saw a narrow path leading deeper into the trees. The branches seemed to form a tunnel, and beyond it, I could make out the faint outline of something in the distance. "Are you sure it's safe?" Jess asked, finally speaking up. She had been unusually quiet all morning, and I could tell she was just as uneasy as the rest of us. "Safe," Ryan laughed. "It's just an old cabin. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words, I muttered, earning a smirk from Emma. We followed Ryan through the narrow path, the trees closing in tighter around us with every step. The further we went, the darker it seemed to get, even though it was still mid-morning. The smell of damp earth filled the air, and every now and then I caught a whiff of something else, something faint but strange, like old wood in decay. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It stood in the middle of the clearing, slouched and forgotten, with its roof caved in on one side and the windows broken. Vines had crawled up the sides, weaving in and out of the cracks in the walls. The door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. "Whoa," Ryan said, sounding impressed. "This is awesome." "Awesome," Emma echoed, her voice low. "This place looks like it's about to collapse." "Yeah, well, that's what makes it cool," Ryan said, already walking toward the front door. "Come on, let's check it out." "Ryan, wait," Jess called after him, but he didn't listen. As we stepped out of the cabin, the clearing didn't feel the same. The air was still, but it was a different kind of stillness, unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The sunlight, which had been peeking through the trees earlier, now seemed duller, like a thick haze had settled over everything. My skin prickled with a feeling I couldn't quite explain. Jess was waiting by the fire pit where we had left her. She looked up as we approached, her eyes wide with concern. "What took you guys so long? I was about to come looking for you." Ryan tried to brush it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "We were just checking out the cellar. There's some weird stuff down there." "Weird how?" Jess asked, her voice sharp. She was already on edge, and I knew anything weird would make it worse. Ryan hesitated, then said symbols, like carved into the ground. "I don't know what they mean, but it looked like some kind of, I don't know, ritual? Or something." Jess's face paled. "Ritual? Are you serious?" "That's it, we're leaving. I'm not staying here another night." "I'm with Jess on this one," Emma chimed in, crossing her arms. "This place is giving me the creeps, and I don't want to find out what those symbols are for." I couldn't argue with them. I didn't want to stay either, not after what we'd seen in the cellar. But Ryan, ever the stubborn one, wasn't ready to pack it in just yet. "Look, I get it, the symbols are weird," he said, trying to sound rational. "But we came all the way out here to explore. It's probably just some old markings from when this place was abandoned. Let's not freak out and overreact." Jess glared at him. "Overreact? You found a ritual carved into the ground of a creepy cabin in the middle of nowhere, Ryan. I'm not sticking around to see what happens next." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but I cut in. "She's right, man. Something feels wrong about this place. We can always come back another time, but we shouldn't push our luck." He looked at me, clearly frustrated, but then he sighed. "All right, fine. We'll head back, but I still think you guys are being paranoid." I wasn't so sure it was paranoia. My gut had been screaming at me since last night, telling me we needed to leave. And now that we'd seen what was in that cellar, I was convinced more than ever that we shouldn't be here. We packed up our gear quickly, each of us working in tense silence. The fire we had built the night before was nothing but ash now, and even that seemed eerie to me, like it had been snuffed out too soon. I caught Emma glancing nervously toward the tree lean a few times, her brow furrowed. Once everything was packed, we started making our way back through the forest. The path was narrow and twisted, just as before, but something about it seemed different. The trees felt taller, their shadows darker, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps on the soft earth. After walking for about 20 minutes, Jess suddenly stopped. "Wait, this isn't the way we came," she said, her voice tight. Ryan rolled his eyes. "It is. I've been keeping track. Just trust me." "No, Ryan," Jess insisted, her eyes scanning the trees. "I remember that rock formation. We didn't pass it on the way in." I looked where she was pointing, and sure enough, there was a cluster of jagged rocks just off the path. I hadn't noticed it before, but Jess was right. We hadn't seen it when we first came through. My stomach dropped. "I don't think this is the right path either," I admitted, trying to stay calm. "We might have taken a wrong turn." Ryan groaned, clearly annoyed. "You guys need to chill. We didn't take a wrong turn. We just need to keep walking, and we'll hit the main trail soon." But even he didn't sound as confident as before. The deeper we walked into the forest, the more disoriented I felt. Everything looked the same, yet slightly off, like the trees were shifting around us. It was almost as if the woods were intentionally confusing us, leading us in circles. Emma, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "I feel like something's following us." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. We all stopped listening. There was nothing at first, just that oppressive silence, but then, faintly I heard it. The soft crunch of leaves, like footsteps, just behind us. Ryan turned around, scanning the trees with narrowed eyes. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We all stood frozen, listening for any other sounds, but the forest remained quiet. Too quiet. "We should pick up the pace," I said, my voice low. "Just in case." No one argued with me. We started walking faster, our steps hurried and tense. But the further we went, the worse the feeling of being watched became. I could sense it now. Something was definitely following us. Every few minutes, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle behind us. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Jess's breathing was shallow, and Emma kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale. Ryan tried to keep up his usual bravado, but even he was starting to crack under the pressure. After another 20 minutes of walking, we stopped again. The path we were on had dead-ended into a thick wall of trees and brambles. "We're lost," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not lost," Ryan said, but there was no conviction in his words. I looked around, trying to make sense of where we were, but it was no use. The trees all looked the same, stretching endlessly in every direction. And the more I looked, the more I felt like they were closing in on us. "Ryan," I said, trying to stay calm, "we need to admit we don't know where we are." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "We'll figure it out. We just need to retrace our steps." "No," Jess snapped. "I'm done with this. We need to call for help. Now." She pulled out her phone, but when she checked the screen, her face went white. "There's no signal." I checked mine too. Nothing. Just a blank screen with no bars, no connection. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. "All right, we just need to stay together and keep moving. We'll find a way out." But as we turned to continue walking, a gust of wind swept through the trees, and with it came a sound, soft at first like a whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, the wind carrying it through the branches. We all froze listening. At first, it was just a wordless murmur, but then clear as day, I heard it. My name. "Mark." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. No one else seemed to have heard it, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What is it?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. I swallowed, shaking my head. "Nothing. Let's go." But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Something was out there, watching us, following us. And it knew my name. The further we walked, the heavier the air became, pressing down on us like the weight of the entire forest was closing in. There was no breeze anymore, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive silence that grew thicker with every step. It felt like the woods had swallowed us whole. And with no signal on our phones and no clear path, it was easy to feel like we were completely alone. Except we weren't. The sound of my name, whispered so clearly, still echoed in my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but every time I turned, there was nothing, just the dense trees and the shadows between them. Whatever was out there was toying with us, staying just out of sight. Just kept her head down, walking fast and muttering under her breath. She hadn't stopped shaking since the moment she'd seen there was no signal. Emma, usually calm and composed, now looked pale, her eyes darting from tree to tree like she was expecting something to jump out at us. Ryan, always the fearless leader, was losing his cool, his face twisted in frustration as he kept checking the map, turning it over like the answer would magically appear if he just looked hard enough. "This can't be right," Ryan muttered, stopping for the 5th time in 10 minutes. "We should have hit the main trail by now." "We're lost, Ryan," Jess snapped, the fear in her voice breaking through the thin veil of anger. "Why can't you just admit it?" Ryan clenched his jaw but didn't respond. His silence said everything we needed to know. I stepped closer to Emma, who had fallen behind slightly, her eyes wide as she scanned the forest. "You all right?" I asked, though I knew the answer. She shook her head. "No, I keep feeling like something's out there watching us." Do you hear it too?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I do." Her eyes locked with mine, and for a moment, there was an understanding between us. Something was in these woods with us, and it wasn't just our imagination. But neither of us wanted to say it out loud, as if giving it words would make it more real. We continued walking, the tension building with every step. The trees loomed larger, and the shadows seemed to twist, and stretch unnaturally, like they were alive, creeping closer. I kept telling myself it was just the fear playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting a soft, eerie glow through the canopy. We had to find our way out before nightfall. The thought of being stuck in this forest after dark sent a shiver down my spine. Ryan stopped suddenly, holding up his hand. "Wait," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" We all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, faintly, just barely audible, I heard it, the sound of whispering. It was distant, like it was being carried on the wind, but there was no wind. It was coming from the trees, from the shadows between them. A low, murmuring voice that didn't belong here. Jess grabbed Ryan's arm, her voice shaky. "What the hell is that?" Ryan's face hardened. "It's nothing. Let's keep moving." But it wasn't nothing. The whispering grew louder the deeper we went. No longer just a faint murmur. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, calling out to us in a language we couldn't understand. Every now and then I swore I could pick out words, our names, phrases, but they slipped away before I could grasp them. "Mark," the voice whispered again, clearer this time. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. This time it wasn't just in my head. It was real. The voice had called my name. Ryan turned around, frowning. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, glancing around at the trees. I heard it again. "It's calling my name." Jess's eyes widened. "What? No, that's not possible." Ryan looked skeptical, but I could see a flicker of fear behind his bravado. "You're just hearing things, man. We're all freaked out." "No," Emma whispered, stepping closer. "I heard it too. It's like the forest is talking to us." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, the whispering grew louder, so loud it seemed to surround us, echoing from every direction. It wasn't just calling my name anymore. It was saying other things, words I couldn't fully understand, but they were there, circling us like a swarm. "Ryan," Jess whimpered, clutching his arm tightly. "Please, we need to get out of here." Ryan, his face pale now, nodded slowly. "Yeah, we do." We started walking again, this time faster, almost jogging, as if we could outrun the whispers. But no matter how fast we moved, the voice followed us, growing louder and more insistent. "Mark!" Emma. It knew all of our names. It was getting closer. My heart raced as we hurried down the path, the trees seeming to blur as the forest closed in around us. The whispering had become deafening now, a constant hum in the air. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, blending together in a chaotic, terrifying chorus. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound stopped. Dead silence. We all froze, breathing hard, looking around. The forest was still again, but the tension in the air remained, thick and heavy. "Why did it stop?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Ryan said, glancing around nervously. "But we need to keep moving." But before we could take another step, something moved in the trees. Just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I saw it. A shadow darting between the trunks. It was fast, too fast to be an animal. My breath caught in my throat. "Did you see that?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it." Ryan's face had gone pale. "We're getting out of here. Now." We turned and started running, our feet pounding against the forest floor. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, endless and unforgiving. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight, my mind racing with panic. Then, out of nowhere, the path opened up. We stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath. The sunlight was fading fast, the sky above us a deep orange, casting long shadows over the clearing. But for the first time in hours, we were out of the thick trees. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we were close to the main trail. Maybe we were going to get out of this nightmare after all. But as I looked around the clearing, my heart sank. In the center of the clearing stood a tree, an old, twisted tree, its bark gnarled and blackened. And at its base, etched into the ground in the same strange symbols we had seen in the cellar, was a circle. A perfect carved circle with those same markings surrounding it, glowing faintly in the fading light. "We're back where we started," Emma whispered, her voice filled with dread. Somehow, despite all the running, despite everything, we had been led right back to the center of it all. Back to the source. We stood there, frozen, staring at the twisted tree in the center of the clearing. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I tried to make sense of it all. How we ended up back here? We had been walking in what we thought was the opposite direction, running even, and yet we were right back where we started. The clearing, the tree, the strange symbols etched into the ground, it was all the same. Jess was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't possible." Ryan shook his head, pacing back and forth, his fists clenched. "No, it's not. We didn't come this way. We were going in the other direction. How the hell did we end up here?" Emma stepped closer to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Mark, what's happening? Why can't we get out?" I didn't have an answer. My throat felt tight, and every instinct in my body was screaming that we needed to leave, but the forest, this place, it wasn't letting us. It was playing with us, keeping us trapped like mice in a maze. And the more we tried to escape, the more we seemed to fall right back to where we started. Ryan stopped pacing, staring at the tree. "There's something about this place, something about that tree," he muttered almost to himself. "I don't know what it is, but I think this is the center of whatever's going on." Jess took a step back, her face pale. "Don't go near it, Ryan. Please." But he didn't listen. He started moving toward the tree, his eyes locked on the strange symbols carved into the ground around it. I could see the confusion and fear etched on his face. But there was something else too. Curiosity. A dangerous kind of curiosity that made my stomach churn. "Ryan, don't!" I called after him. But he kept walking, stepping into the circle of symbols. I don't know what I expected to happen, but the moment his foot crossed the line, something shifted. The air around us grew colder, and the sky above seemed to darken, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. The shadows in the trees grew longer, creeping toward us like fingers reaching out from the forest's edge. "Ryan, get back here!" Jess screamed, but her voice sounded distant, like the air itself was swallowing her words. Ryan stopped in front of the tree, staring up at its twisted, blackened branches. I could see his breath coming in short, shallow puffs, like the air was thinner near the tree, harder to breathe. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the rough bark. The moment his fingers made contact with the tree, there was a sound, a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from the ground beneath us. It was faint at first, like a distant earthquake, but it grew louder, stronger. The earth beneath our feet seemed to vibrate, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Ryan yanked his hand away from the tree, stumbling back. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking down at his hand. Jess ran to him, grabbing his arm. "What's wrong? What happened?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at his hand, his face pale and confused. It had burned. It felt like the tree was burning me. Emma took a step closer, her eyes wide with fear. "Let me see." Ryan held out his hand, and we all saw it at the same time. A mark, small but unmistakable, was etched into his skin. It looked like one of the symbols from the circle, a strange, looping design that seemed to twist and curve in impossible ways. It wasn't red or raised like a burn would be. Instead, it looked as though it had been tattooed onto his skin, dark and permanent. "Ryan, what is that?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. It just appeared when I touched the tree. We need to get out of here," I said, my voice coming out more forceful than I intended. "Now!" Emma nodded, backing away from the tree. "Mark's right. Whatever this is, it's not natural. We shouldn't be here." Ryan looked down at his hand again, still in shock, but he nodded. Yeah, let's go." We turned away from the tree and started walking, faster this time, desperate to put distance between us and that place. But as we moved, the forest around us seemed to change. The trees were closer together now, their branches twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. The path beneath our feet felt unfamiliar, even though we were sure we were heading in the right direction. "Mark," Emma whispered, walking beside me. "It feels like the forest is moving." I glanced around, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The trees seemed to shift subtly, like they were alive, like they were watching us, guiding us, herding us back to where we didn't want to go. "Keep moving," I said, my voice tight with fear. "We have to keep moving." But it was no use. No matter how fast we walked, how many turns we took, the forest kept closing in around us. The sky above grew darker and darker, even though the sun shouldn't have set yet. And the whispering, those faint, eerie voices, had returned, growing louder with every step we took. "Mark, Jess, Ryan." The voices called our names, soft at first, but growing more insistent, more urgent. "Shut up," Ryan shouted, his voice breaking. "Just shut up." But the voices didn't stop. They only grew louder, circling us, echoing through the trees. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, calling out to us, drawing us back. Then suddenly we broke through the trees and found ourselves back in the clearing. Back at the tree. "No," Jess whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, this can't be happening." Ryan cursed under his breath, his face twisted with fear and frustration. "How do we get back here again? We were walking the other way." Emma was crying now, her hands trembling as she covered her ears, trying to block out the voices. "We're trapped. We're never getting out." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything was going to be okay, but I couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. Whatever was happening in this forest, it was beyond anything I could understand, and the more we tried to escape, the deeper we seemed to fall into its grip. The tree stood in the center of the clearing, twisted and gnarled, its branches stretching out like claws. And at its base, the symbols carved into the earth glowed faintly, pulsing with a dark, unnatural light. "We're not getting out," I whispered, my voice hollow. "Not until we figure out what this place wants." Ryan looked at me, his face pale and drawn. "What are you saying, Mark?" "I'm saying," I swallowed hard, forcing myself to say the words. "I'm saying we're not just lost. We're being hunted." The air around us seemed to grow colder as the realization sank in. We weren't just wandering aimlessly in the forest, lost and disoriented. Something was here with us. Something intelligent, something ancient, something that wanted us right where we were trapped. Jess was pacing back and forth, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "What do you mean, hunted?" "Hunted by what?" Ryan looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mark, you can't be serious. This is a forest. What could possibly be hunting us?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew deep down that we were being watched, herded like prey. Every time we tried to escape, the forest twisted around us, pulling us back to the clearing, back to that twisted tree and the symbols on the ground. I wasn't sure how or why, but it was as if the forest itself was alive, and it was playing with us. Emma, who had been sitting silently on the ground, looked up at me, her face pale. Do you think it's the tree? That thing in the cellar, the symbols, are they connected?" I swallowed hard, not wanting to believe it, but knowing there was no other explanation. "I think the tree and those symbols, they're part of whatever is controlling this place. It's like we've stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see." Jess stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes blazing with anger and fear. "So what? You're saying we've triggered some kind of curse? Is that it?" "We're cursed." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his usual confidence gone. "Look, we don't know what's going on, but we're not just going to sit here and wait for something bad to happen. We got to do something." I nodded, even though I had no idea what we could do. "We need to figure out how to break this, whatever it is. There has to be a way." Emma stood up slowly, wiping the tears from her face. "But how? We don't even know what we're dealing with." Ryan's frustration boiled over. "We deal with it by getting out of here. We're wasting time talking about curses and symbols. There's got to be a way out, and I'm going to find it." He turned, marching toward the edge of the clearing. But the moment he stepped past the carved symbols, the whispering began again. Louder this time, more urgent. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, swirling around us in a chaotic, nightmarish symphony. "Ryan, Ryan," the voices called, his name echoing through the air like a chant. Ryan froze, his face going pale as the voices grew louder, the air thickening around him. "Shut up! "Shut up," he screamed, covering his ears with his hands. The voices didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent, the sound filling the air until it was unbearable. I could hear my own name now, Jess's, Emma's, all of us being called over and over again, as if the forest itself was calling out to us, demanding we listen. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a branch snapping, and the ground beneath Ryan seemed to shift. I watched in horror as the earth opened up beneath him, roots and vines twisting around his legs, pulling him down. "Ryan!" Jess screamed, running toward him. "Get back!" I shouted, grabbing her before she could reach him. Ryan struggled, his eyes wide with terror as the roots wrapped around his ankles, dragging him toward the tree. He clawed at the ground, trying to pull himself free, but the more he struggled, the tighter the roots held him. "Help me!" Ryan cried, his voice hoarse with panic. I ran to him, grabbing his arms and pulling with everything I had. Jess and Emma joined me, all of us pulling as hard as we could, but it was no use. The roots were too strong, too fast. They were dragging him toward the base of the tree, toward the glowing symbols. "We're not letting you go!" Jess screamed, tears streaming down her face as she tugged desperately on Ryan's arm. But it was happening too fast. Ryan's body was halfway buried now, the roots tightening around him like snakes. His face was twisted in pain, and his hands were slipping from our grasp. "I can't. Hold on." Ryan gasped, his face pale with fear. "Don't let go," I shouted, but I could feel him slipping away. The ground seemed to pulse beneath us, the air growing heavier as the whispering reached a fever pitch. The voices were deafening now, calling Ryan's name over and over again, like a twisted chant. Then with a final, sickening pull, the roots yanked him out of our hands. "No!" Jess screamed, her voice raw with grief. Ryan's body was dragged into the base of the tree, disappearing into the dark, gnarled roots. The ground closed up behind him, leaving nothing but the twisted bark and the glowing symbols. For a moment, the world went silent. Jess collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Emma knelt beside her, her face white with shock, tears streaming down her cheeks. I stood there, numb, unable to process what had just happened. Ryan was gone. 1 minute, he had been standing there, determined to find a way out, and the next, he had been swallowed by the forest. By something in this place. "What? What just happened?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what had happened or why, but I knew one thing for certain now. This place wasn't just toying with us. It was hunting us one by one, and Ryan was the first to be claimed. Jess looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small and broken. I shook my head, my mind racing. "We need to figure out how to stop this. The tree, the symbols, they're part of it. There's something here, some kind of power, and we need to break it before it takes anyone else." "But how?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "We don't even know what it is." I didn't have an answer, but I knew we couldn't just sit here and wait to be the next victim. There had to be a way to stop whatever was happening. There had to be. I looked at the tree, its gnarled branches twisting up into the darkening sky, and the glowing symbols carved into the ground around it. This was the source. This was where everything began. And if we wanted to survive, we had to destroy it. "We have to destroy the tree," I said, my voice firm. Just looked at me like I was crazy. "Destroy it? How? It's huge." "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's the only way. That tree is connected to all of this. We have to stop it, or none of us are getting out of here alive." Emma wiped her tears, standing up beside me. "I'll help. Whatever we need to do, I'll help." Jess nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. "Me too. I'm not losing anyone else." With a new sense of purpose, we gathered what we could, rocks, sticks, anything we thought might help us break through the twisted bark of the tree. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. As we stood in front of the tree, ready to begin, the air around us grew cold again. The whispering returned, softer now, more distant, but still there. Watching, waiting. I gripped the rock in my hand, my knuckles white. This was it, the final stand. We were either going to break the curse of this place, or it was going to take us all. And there was no going back now. The silence before we moved felt almost unbearable, the air thick and heavy around us. The darkening sky above pressed down, and the shadows from the trees stretched out like grasping fingers, surrounding us. It was like the forest knew what we were planning, and it didn't want us to succeed. I tightened my grip on the large rock in my hand, glancing at Jess and Emma. They stood beside me, their faces pale but determined. We had to do this. We had to destroy the tree. There was no other way out. Ryan was already gone, swallowed by this cursed place, and if we didn't act now, it was only a matter of time before it took us too. Jess wiped at her eyes, still red from crying, and gave a small nod. "Let's do it," she said, her voice shaky but strong. I turned to the twisted, blackened tree standing in the center of the clearing. Its branches hung low and gnarled, like long, skeletal arms reaching for us. The ground around its base was marked with those glowing symbols, symbols that had drawn us back here, over and over again, like a beacon in the dark. Emma stepped forward first, her face set in a look of grim determination. She raised her own rock above her head and brought it down against the bark with a loud, echoing thud. The sound reverberated through the clearing, almost unnatural, like the forest itself was screaming in protest. I followed, bringing my rock down on the twisted trunk of the tree. The bark splintered under the impact, but not much. This wasn't going to be easy. Jess was next, smashing her rock into the side of the tree. Together, the three of us attacked the tree, hitting it again and again. Each strike sent vibrations through the ground, and the air around us seemed to grow colder, darker. It was as if the forest was reacting to our defiance, trying to stop us. But we kept going, pounding the tree with everything we had. As we hit the tree, the whispering grew louder, swelling in volume until it was a deafening roar. The voices were frantic now, angry, like a chorus of invisible beings screaming at us, trying to force us to stop. I could feel their presence all around us, circling, pressing in, but I refused to give in to the fear. With every hit, the bark cracked more, and sap, thick, dark, almost black, began to ooze from the trunk like blood. It smelled foul, like something rotten, something ancient. The ground beneath our feet shook, small tremors rippling through the dirt, as if the very earth was alive and protesting. Emma paused for a moment, panting. "Do you think it's working?" she asked, glancing at me, her voice filled with a mix of hope and desperation. "I don't know," I replied, gasping for breath. "But we have to keep going. We don't have a choice." Jess wiped the sweat from her brow, nodding. "If this tree is the heart of whatever's happening, we need to destroy it. We can't stop now." We redoubled our efforts, striking the tree with everything we had left. With each blow, the cracks in the bark deepened, and the sap flowed faster, pooling at our feet. The voices in the air became shrill, almost unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard. My head pounded with the noise, but I couldn't stop. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. The trunk of the tree split down the middle, a deep fissure running from the base to its twisted branches. The ground shook violently beneath us, and I stumbled backward, barely catching my balance. "Look!" Emma shouted, pointing at the tree. The glowing symbols at the base of the tree began to flicker, their light dimming, fading in and out like a dying flame. The air around us seemed to shift, and for a moment, the oppressive weight that had hung over us since we arrived began to lift. "We're doing it!" Jess cried, her voice filled with a new sense of hope. But then, something changed. The tree shuddered violently, and from the deep crack in its trunk, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible, but then it began to take shape. A dark, twisted figure, tall, skeletal, with long, spindly arms and a face that was more darkness than flesh, began to emerge from the tree. My heart stopped. The thing, whatever it was slowly pulling itself free from the tree, its blackened limbs twisting and contorting as it rose to its full height. Its eyes, if they were even eyes, were hollow, empty pits, but they seemed to lock onto us, filled with an unimaginable rage. Jess screamed, stumbling back as the creature stepped forward, its long, claw-like fingers reaching toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Emma and pulling her away from the tree. Jess followed, all of us sprinting for the edge of the clearing as fast as we could. But the creature was fast, unnaturally fast. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs too long, too thin. The shadows seemed to bend around it, like the darkness was part of it, wrapping it in a cloak of night. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches slapping at our faces. But I could hear it behind us, its footsteps heavy, deliberate, getting closer. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We burst through the trees and into another small clearing, but there was no escape. The creature was there, its hollow eyes fixed on us, blocking the way forward. Jess was sobbing now, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "What do we do? Mark, what do we do?" I didn't have an answer. We were cornered, trapped. The creature stepped closer, its body twisting unnaturally, as if it were made of shadows and bone. It reached out with one long, skeletal hand, the fingers curling toward us. And then, something happened that I couldn't explain. The symbols, those strange, glowing symbols we had been so afraid of, began to pulse again. But this time, they weren't filled with malice. This time, they glowed bright, burning with a light so intense it made the creature hiss and recoil. It stumbled backward, its body convulsing as the light from the symbols grew stronger, brighter. I watched, stunned, as the creature's form began to disintegrate, the shadows peeling away from its body like smoke in the wind. It let out a shrill, inhuman screech, thrashing as the light consumed it. And then, with one final, ear-piercing cry, it was gone. The forest fell silent. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there breathing heavily, our hearts pounding in our chests, trying to process what had just happened. Jess was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Is it over?" I looked around, half expecting the creature to reappear, but the forest remained quiet. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over us since we arrived was gone, and the air felt lighter, clearer. Even the sky above seemed brighter, as if the darkness had finally lifted. I think it's over," I said, my voice hoarse. Emma let out a shaky breath, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We did it. We actually did it." We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, and then, slowly, we made our way back to the clearing. The tree was still there, but it was different now. The symbols on the ground were gone, and the bark was no longer twisted and blackened. It looked like just an ordinary tree now, as if whatever power had been controlling it was gone. Ryan was gone, too, buried somewhere beneath the twisted roots. We hadn't been able to save him, but we were alive, and for now, that was enough. Without another word, we turned and began walking, this time toward home.